You're listening to a 3CR podcast of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia.
Radio MMT respectfully acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting, the Wurundjeri people, and we are broadcasting to the Kulin Nations. Our focus is economics, that is, how stuff is produced and distributed. We recognise that for many tens of thousands of years, First Nations people's connection to country successfully embodied the world's oldest continuous economy, which was catastrophically disrupted by genocide and displacement. We acknowledge that we have much to learn to reshape our current extractive and exploitive system to achieve sustainable prosperity for everyone.
Radio MMT. Economics for the rest of us with Anne
and Kev.
Radio MMT.
Looking at the world through the lens of modern monetary theory.
Radio MMT. Macroeconomics for a well-being economy.
Macroeconomics? Isn't that incredibly boring?
No, Kevin, it's incredibly interesting. It's all about who gets what and why.
Who gets what and why? Okay, I'm in.
RadioMMT@gmail.com.
Incredibly interesting macroeconomics for the rest of us. Welcome to Radio MMT. How are you, Anne?
I'm good. How are you, Kevin?
Yeah, not too bad. We missed the last show we did, which was on International Women's Day.
Do you think anyone missed us?
Yeah, I don't know.
We were busy though.
So.
We were off seeing a film.
We were seeing other women who were presenting that film we were talking about for ages and ages called Finding the Money.
Finding the Money. It is the film that centres on the MMT story of money and the MMT, or modern monetary theory, approach to national so-called debt. So we've seen it now, Kevin. Have you got any thoughts on the film, having seen it?
Well, it was well attended. We were wondering whether we'd be able to do more than one screening, whether there'd be enough demand, and the first showing was full up, and we had a second showing the next day. So there's interest out there, which is really good. It was really presentable. It read well, and my test for that was I managed to get Fiona Patten.
Remind us who Fiona is.
So Fiona Patten founded the Sex Party, which later changed its name to the Reason Party, and she was a state MP. I read her book, and she's very effective as an independent of changing policy. So she's responsible for things like improving the conditions for sex workers, which was her initial focus, and then she successfully convinced the Labor state government to set up some safe injecting rooms. She's all about that sort of the fringes. But so as an independent, to effect change with a mainstream government that might not particularly be interested in that sort of stuff. Very effective. So she didn't see the film. She went to see Stephanie Kelton being interviewed by the ABC at the State Library on the Saturday. And she went in blind. I was able to contact her and said, look, just come and have a look at this because I think you'd be interested. So she went in with no preconceived ideas or no knowledge of MMT. I caught up with her afterwards and I said, so what do you think of that? And she went, it's totally transformed the way I think about the economy.
Wow. So that's a good test case.
Yeah. And I thought that was terrific. What did you think? What was your impression?
One of the things I came away with was I didn't think I would learn a whole lot more MMT, but what it reinforced for me is that reclaiming our understanding of this public utility we call money, when we're reclaiming that, we're also reclaiming our history. And you look at history and the events of past hundreds of years in a totally different way. So I feel like it doesn't surprise me when people who are into history or anthropology or so on, they really click with MMT because it is the real story of a fundamental social institution that's been evolving for like 5,000 years.
Yeah, well, I'm just pushing through the end of that book by Graeber, 5,000 Years of Debt. And what occurs to me, Anne, is we constantly say that you and I, we're not economists. And I don't know whether that's kind of an excuse or something, but I don't want to be an economist. There are people who are doing that already, and they're going to be better students and better academics than I ever will be. My job is to understand them. And reading Graeber, it helped me understand that I'm acting more as an anthropologist, not an economist, because once you've got the information about what constitutes the economy, how it works, etc., it's up to figuring out how that applies to people. That's not
Or
economics.
sociology. Yeah.
Or sociology. And so that's our role, I think, Anne. I think we finally, after doing the show for 4 or 5 years, we
You
figured out what we're
finally
doing.
figured it out. And just to mention also that for those of you who couldn't get to any of the events that did occur in a few of the capital cities around Australia, coming up in this hour, we've got a couple of segments from a Q&A that was held at the film screening that was at Trades Hall in Carlton on the 8th of March. And I just want to apologise for some of the sound quality there because we didn't have good mics on the people asking the questions, but you can sort of tell from the answers that were given by the panel what they were asking about. So this panel was moderated by Dr. Stephen Hale of Modern Money Lab, and they were hosting the film tour. And on the panel were film director Maren Poitras, economist Professor Stephanie Kelton, and constitutional lawyer Shireen Morris.
Play a bit of a clip first and speak about various things afterwards.
Okay, let's have a listen to the first clip.
But for now, please sit back, relax and prepare to be amazed by an extraordinarily good film. So now we'll watch the movie. I just wanted to ask Shireen, did you enjoy the movie?
Yeah, I thought it was great.
Prominent legal academic and campaigner, Shireen Morris.
And Stephanie, I had this mind-blowing moment a few years ago when I worked for a long time with the Aboriginal leader Noel Pearson, and he said, you need to read Bill Mitchell's textbook, Shireen, and you need to read Stephanie Kelton's book. And I did that. And would you believe it, like in my late 30s, was when I realised that we run a bipartisan public policy in Australia that deliberately keeps people unemployed as our primary means of fighting inflation. That absolutely blew my mind. I'd gone through all this time not realising that both Liberal and Labor governments for the last, 40 years or more, adopt this. Both Labor and Liberal, there is no debate about this. To the point that the Commonwealth Parliament delegates to the Reserve Bank of Australia and says, you guys have independence to tinker with the interest rate tool as the primary means of fighting inflation, to deliberately raise the unemployment rate. And at the end of last year, the Treasurer relinquished his override power with basically zero debate. So we should be discussing this stuff much more. How can we all be sitting back watching hundreds of thousands of more Australians be deliberately made unemployed? At the same time, the government claims to care about addressing disadvantage. And at the same time, we claim to care about closing the gap on Indigenous disadvantage. How can we close the gap on Indigenous disadvantage when around half of Indigenous Australians are out of work, right? And suffering intergenerational poverty? How can we close the gap on that disadvantage at the same time as deliberately raising the unemployment rate?
Considering that sovereignty was never ceded and that there was a genocide here, would saying that First Nations people need to contribute to jobs when they might actually be owed some sort of economic reparations be a little poor taste? So I'm wondering how a ethnic group may fit into this that has genocide committed against them and maybe financial reparations.
Sure. The job guarantee is one policy proposal.
Stephanie Kelton.
It's like the minimum wage is one policy, and advocating for an increase in the minimum wage doesn't solve a whole range of other injustices and problems in the economy or in society. In the US, we have a very good economist by the name of William Darity. He goes by Sandy, so we call him Sandy Darity. And William Darity and Derek Hamilton are African-American scholars and economists. And for many years, the two of them, they have advocated both a federal job guarantee and reparations for slavery. and baby bonds to address wealth inequality. So they have sort of a suite of policies so that you can easily pair a federal job guarantee with a whole host of other things.
So I was wondering, in regards to your experiences in terms of being in proximity to politics, any thoughts that you might have around if MMT were to be taken up, how might what kind of steps might be taken to try and make sure that the money is used to distribute resources to those who need them.
Okay, so MMT has been, in effect, taken up because it's a description of the monetary system that we have today, not a gold standard, right? It's a floating exchange rate, fiat currency, governments issue the currency. So it's a description of the monetary system we have, the mechanics of government finance. How does it actually work? Government spending and taxing, what happens when the government issues bonds and all that. It's descriptive. So with that description, with that new lens, right, a better understanding of where the limits are and what the capacities of the state or the government really are, you can have what you said, which is a better debate, so that we can have a more informed electorate. Better public policy debates doesn't guarantee you get better public policy. At least, though, it sort of levels the playing field so that the rest of us can't get bamboozled by elected officials who say, well, I'd love to be able to help you, but we've got this deficit, we've got the debt. So we're kind of clearing the way for our democracy to function in a way that allows us to have these political debates. Whether we get the kinds of policies that we might hope for is a different matter, right? It depends on whether the votes will be there, whether the pressure will come to bear on the people that we elect to represent us. Will they go in and advocate for the things that the public wants?
Given that it's International Women's Day today, and one of the common issues when talking about the economy, talking unpaid labour, that drives the wheels of the economy around society. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that fits in to your model, and also how all those people who don't receive money access savings. So it's sort of like, where's the feminist perspective?
When I'm thinking about the MMT idea of a job guarantee,
Shireen Morris.
There's all these opportunities that come with that. So if the federal government acted as an employer of last resort, and instead of just having a welfare safety net, we had a job safety net. Let's just say when we do need to pull money out of the economy and then the unemployment rate rises, instead of putting all those people on welfare, the government could offer them a job at the minimum wage, which, kind of used to be the bipartisan approach in the post-war era when unemployment rates were very, very low. If we returned to that kind of approach, it makes me think of all the different ways that you could create jobs in ways that, as the documentary suggested, address supply issues, address the climate change challenge, address the housing shortage challenge. And part of that picture might be properly valuing some of the completely unpaid female labour. Would you agree with that, Stephanie?
That is the idea, absolutely. You can define the job as broadly as you like. So it's effectively a public option. You're saying, let's have a public option in the labor market so that anybody who's ready, willing, and able to work and can't find a job elsewhere in the economy can walk in the door and take a job. But you could also say, there are people who are working really hard, caring for others. They might be in elder care work, caring for young people, caring for a sick spouse or relative. That is work that could be remunerated in the job guarantee. You can define those jobs any way society chooses to and say that ought to be paid work. Those people ought to be paid for what they're doing. So yeah, sure. How do you create?
How do you create the political will?
Well, we're trying to do that.
Doing the things like this. What are the benefits of advocating for a federal job guarantee? What do you get out of it. And the RBA is saying unemployment is 4.1%, it needs to rise to 4.5% or so. This is what they're still saying, yes? Even in the current moment, they think unemployment needs to increase to get inflation back down to target. Well, Jerome Powell, our Fed chair, said much the same thing. It was going to take some pain in the economy. Households were going to feel pain. Businesses were going to feel pain. It was going to require job losses. It was the only way to bring inflation down. And so the Fed took interest rates from 0 to 5.25 percentage points, and doggone it, the unemployment rate just refused to increase. We've had unemployment below 4% now for 24 months, so 2 years. So clearly this trade-off is not right. You can actually have inflation come down without the kind of pain they were talking about. But your question is, so you make a commitment and you say anybody who wants a job has a right to a job. What are the benefits of that? Well, what are the costs of unemployment? What costs do we bear as a society when we allow hundreds of thousands and millions of people to become jobless, many of them long-term jobless? Their lives are hurt, and the longer you endure unemployment, the more unemployable you become. Employers don't want to touch the unemployed because their skills atrophy, and people say, oh, you haven't been in the labor market in a long time. I can't take a chance on you. But you're losing all of the value of what they could have produced if you had simply allowed them to work. By definition, an unemployed person is someone who is seeking a job and can't find one. So why on earth would you not capture the time that they're willing to offer and find something productive and socially useful for them to do when we have a myriad of problems facing us every day in our economy? You mentioned housing crisis, shortages, care work, just go down the list. The climate, there are more things for people to do than there are people to do them. So it's a no-brainer in so many respects. And we pay for it anyway. We pay for it in, truancy, dropout rates, crime, poor health care. We're paying for the unemployment anyway. We're just not getting any of the benefits. Makes no sense.
Lots of people don't have money to meet their basic needs. And so what's the view of MMT about a basic income?
So you're right. The government is spending the money into the economy, and once they do that, somebody has it. And you're also right that it isn't at all equitably distributed. So one idea is to say, well, we should protect people who lack sufficient income so that they can have their basic needs met. And that could be done through something like you hear people talk about universal basic income. I always get a little bit nervous entering this conversation because I need to know exactly what someone has in mind. Sometimes people talk about a UBI and they say, well, Alaska does that. Like, I consider it a Christmas bonus. It's, anywhere between $1,700 and $2,400, depending on what oil prices are at that point in time. That's not a basic income, okay? So are we talking about enough money to live on? And then what is that number? And then are we saying it's truly universal, so everyone gets it? That's what universal basic income means to me. It means universal, everybody gets it, and it means basic income, it's enough to meet your basic needs. Now we're talking about a lot of money. Is it $30,000 a year per person? And you give everybody $30,000. You just ratchet everybody up, right? And then there's the inflation question. So people usually then say, well, you tax the people at the very top. So then it's not really a basic income after all, is it? If you're taxing these people very heavily, just give the people at the bottom the money. And then you have to worry about the inflation risk. What we need are universal basic services, because at the end of the day, that's what people need.
Well, there was a lot in there, Kevin.
Yeah, no, it was a good discussion, and hopefully a lot of the audience were fresh to this. We don't want to be preaching to the converted. We don't want to be in our own bubble the whole time. And it sounds like there were some people who had a little bit of an idea about MMT but hadn't really fleshed it out much, which was good.
So one of the things that I really liked with what Stephanie was saying there is she made it very clear that MMT is descriptive. So what it's doing is it's describing the monetary system as it works now. It's describing the national accounting procedures as we are doing them now. And so MMT is not something that we're trying to get to. So as MMT advocates, we're not saying let's try and do MMT because we're already doing it in a sense. It's not something we take up. But I would also extend upon what Stephanie was saying, because as well as being descriptive of the monetary system, MMT is also an analytical framework. So what that means is that MMT describes all the different kinds of monetary systems that we currently have now. So, for example, the monetary system Australia has is different from the monetary system that the EU has and any of the EU countries have. And then, of course, MMT describes all the different kinds of monetary systems we've had throughout history, including things like gold standards. But also, even more than that, the way it's analytical and goes beyond just being descriptive is that MMT can tell you the likely reasons for why your economy might be doing well or the reasons that it might not be doing so well. So, for example, if you're looking at Japan and you go, well, how is it that they don't have a whole lot of inflation but their interest rates are near zero? Well, MMT is an analytical framework to describe that. But people often think that MMT is something that you implement. And when we're advocating for it, we're not advocating to get to MMT. What we're advocating for is for people to understand the monetary system through MMT.
Yeah, to shift from the current neoclassical understanding of the economy, which we believe is fundamentally flawed. We don't just believe it, we understand why it's fundamentally flawed. If you apply an MMT lens to the economy, where money comes from and how it's distributed and how, at the moment, unevenly distributed into the economy, because we're using a neoclassical model, we're using a neoliberal model of how to run the economy. And so that funnels large amounts of cash to fewer and fewer people and sets up greater and greater inequality.
Yes. Stephanie was also making that distinction between the economics that we can learn from MMT and the politics that we might use to apply what we learn from MMT. And she was talking in terms of electoral politics, but I reckon even if you have a more, revolutionary theory of change, I would advocate that you still need to understand how our monetary system works, because I reckon even after the revolution, we're going to be using money.
Yeah. I mean, money essentially is a public utility which is applied to make resources available. Like, this understanding we have of money at the moment is that it's like a pot of gold and it has some intrinsic value and you need to hoard as much of it as you possibly can. And the game at the moment is to accumulate as many numbers as you possibly can.
So we have the government who issues the currency thinking they need to save dollars.
Yeah, and so we have some acceptance that we can use this public utility to fund things like armies and police forces and legal systems, and then for some reason it stops. Like the only thing that you need to do is have some sort of law and order program, and then everything else is up for grabs.
Yeah. So if you take away that argument that, well, we've funded the military so much that now we can't afford to fund hospitals, and if you take away the argument that the dollars have run out, then they have to say straight up they don't want to fund the hospitals.
Yeah. So MMT sees through this cloud of misinformation. And neoclassical economics, the stuff that we're using at the moment, the system of economics we're using at the moment, started coming back into fashion in the mid-'70s, which is bunkum. This is the NAIRU, and we will go on about the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment until it is dismantled. And I'll just say this quite plainly. Any Labor politician who states the NAIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, as a legitimate measure of how the economy should run, should resign. They are a traitor to the cause.
Fighting words,
well, it's
Kevin.
true. If you're saying that as a Labor politician that you're prepared to throw people onto the unemployment heap for some bogus inflation scheme, get out of politics. You shouldn't be there.
That's what Shireen Morris was kind of referring to there. And I thought she made a great case for how this bad economics, like the NAIRU, which says that we need to have a certain amount of the population unemployed, in other words, we're barring them from having full access to the economy. She was kind of making that case that the bad economic ideas, they attack unemployed workers and they also attack First Nations people. And so, it's the common enemy, really.
Yeah, just making a bad situation worse. And it's because they're just taking this blind advice from a flawed economic model. Do you know what happens when you do that?
Do tell me.
Everyone ends up broke.
No.
It's true.
I could see where you're taking this, Kevin.
Do you want to know what it's like to be broke? Scott Levine will tell us.
I'm broke. Skin. Strapped. Brassic. This old fella come round to my crumbling abode. The band used to rehearse in his garage. I know he's always suffered with some very serious mental health problems, but to me, he's always been a very kind and decent fella. He knew I was having a rough time, so on this day, he brought round 2 bottles of gin, 4 bottles of wine, some Frey Bentos pies, 6 tins of cheap Irish stew, a packet of ginger nuts, and a loaf of shit bread. I was grateful because I was hungry and I was thirsty. I was always thirsty. Broke. Skin. Strapped. Brassic.
That was Broke by Scott Levine. I heard that the other day and I thought I had to give it a run. Sorry, I should have given it a language warning. I do apologise.
He's a fantastic storyteller.
That's a beauty. That's where we're headed to with the current model that we've got. Needs replacing, Anne. Need to replace the model.
Just think, if we had a job guarantee, that song might never have gotten written.
Yeah, exactly.
There are many ways that you can keep up to date with 3CR news, events and programs. The 3CR website is a great spot to catch all your shows via audio on demand or scroll through our range of podcasts. It's also where you can sign up to our monthly newsletter, buy yourself a new t-shirt or check out archival audio from past broadcasts. Of course, we're also on Twitter @3CR and Instagram @3CR Melbourne. But don't forget our mighty AM band. Catch us anytime on 855 AM. Keep in touch. 3cr.org.au.
You're with Anne and Kev on Radio MMT.
At 3CR Community Radio in Melbourne, Australia.
And wherever you get your podcasts.
Economics for the rest of us.
Hey, now, I just want to mention, one of the things that happened while watching Finding the Money was the obvious omission of Bill Mitchell.
One of the founders of modern monetary theory, this kind of economics.
Yeah, there was lots of talk about Warren Mosler and
Randall Wray was in there.
Yeah, you can't mention those people without mentioning Bill, because he was one of the originals. It's like Paul and John. It's like Mick and Keith. Anyway, so I spoke to Bill about that. I asked him about it. Now, Bill has been pushing the MMT barrow for decades against headwinds and ridicule and all sorts of stuff. And this is his life's work. It's his life's project. So he declined to be involved in this. He was invited. He gave a fair amount of time of interview. And when he saw the final edit, he wasn't happy with his representation. Part of the interview that made the cut was him talking about banking, which is not his speciality. He's far more inclined to talk about the job guarantee, etc. And he also thought that the documentary was very US-centric.
Which it was,
which
you
it
have
was,
to admit.
Predominantly had Americans in. I'm going to read, and I asked him if it's okay. An important point is that many of the contentious issues that arise with MMT, like trade and open economies, only really apply to small open economies like Australia and the LDCs, with LDCs as less developed countries. So their constant emphasis on America never addresses those problems. This has always been the issue since we first started the project. Best wishes, Bill. I'm trying to get my head around that, but I guess if you apply an MMT understanding of your economy to a smaller economy, I think the dominance of the US dollar is in conflict with a lot of independence of smaller economies. The US dollar is used as an instrument to assert its dominance over the world economy, and I think that's the issue that Bill's talking about. I need to do more research to understand that properly. But look, the point is this: we supported the movie because we think it has good general applicability to audiences.
Yeah, it's very accessible for the basic ideas of MMT, and Bill, of course, is talking about something that's a little bit more advanced, and I kind of feel that all the economists have a different emphasis, all the first generation and the second generation economists, and I think we need to hear from all of them to get the full picture.
Yeah, and this is kind of insider stuff. So, and I told Bill I think that this is going to do a good job of spreading the MMT word. And this documentary and Stephanie, in my opinion, do that rather well.
Speaking of Stephanie, we can head back to the second half of the Q&A session that was held after the screening of the movie on March the 8th. And I just wanted to point out that when Stephanie mentions this fiscal policy, this is economic jargon for talking about the federal government's capacity to spend and tax. And when she's talking about relaxing fiscal policy, what she's talking about is you increase the spending and or you decrease the taxing. And I thought I'd also note too that Stephanie talks about tax revenue, and this always confused me when the MMT economists would talk about tax revenue, but they're using that word revenue not in the sense of income. So when they talk about the government having tax revenue, they don't mean that's income for the government. What they're saying is that this is money that is returned to the government via taxation.
Tax returns. You could just call it tax return. Yeah.
In fact, tax return is kind of the equivalent of burning money, which is what we saw in the film. So when you pay your federal taxes, you might as well be burning that money.
Rightio. Back to the interview?
Let's do it.
Where do you think we're at in terms of the public knowledge of MMT?
Where are we? We go sometimes 2 steps forward and 1 step back.
Stephanie Kelton.
You know, you look at the political race in the UK and you see the Labour Party and you hear this, you know, my mother taught me how to balance the checkbook when I was a little girl. So there's a lot of work to do.
Does MMT mean that governments don't have to borrow money at all, and that they, as long as they are an issuer, as a state government or a local council couldn't issue, then they would just basically...
Spend, just say spend.
Just spend.
Yeah. I preempted the print. I didn't want him to say print, just spend.
If we were to start our economy from scratch, there should be no public debt. Is that the logic?
So the currency itself is an IOU. There's that scene in the film where Marin asks, is this, they say this is debt. No, it's not debt. Well, they say it's an asset for the person who has it, but it's a liability for the person who issued it, which is the Federal Reserve, which is, the fiscal agent of the government, it's part of government. No, it's not an asset or a liability. Well, I'm sorry, that's how accounting works. It's one or the other, and it's both, right? It's the asset to the person who's got it and somebody issued it. So while it's in our hands circulating, it's our asset, but it is still an obligation of the issuer, and their obligation is to accept it back in payment of taxes, fees, fines. In a sense, you can't have debt-free anything. As long as we have money, there are going to be 2 sides on that balance sheet. But what we wouldn't have is the thing we call the national debt, right? What we do today is every time there's a deficit that pops out of the budget box at the end of the year, the government issues a number of bonds, notes, bills to match up the deficit. So quick numbers. Government spends $100 into the economy, taxes 90 back out. It's run a deficit. There are $10 in the economy somewhere. But now it says, oh, I have a deficit of 10. I got to sell treasuries. No, you don't, but they do. So they sell these bonds. Someone in the economy gives up their $10 and purchases the bonds. Now, instead of holding the currency, they've got interest-bearing money, which is really what the bonds are.
And so, Stephanie, is that why we do that middleman bond issuing thing? Like, why do we do it?
We do it because it's an anachronism. It's just a holdover from the gold standard. In the old days, if you just spent the funds into somebody's hands and the government said anybody with $35 can have an ounce of gold, well, you can run out of gold. So you want to be pretty careful about how many people you allow to have $35. So if you can sell bonds, you can take the $35 away, replace it with a bond instead. The bond's not convertible on demand into gold. So the treasuries were important because they helped you protect your gold reserves. Then we went off the gold standard. And it was like, okay, now why are we issuing bonds? Well, the central bank uses the treasury market to achieve monetary policy objectives, mostly hitting its interest rate target. But now the central bank just pays interest on reserves. It just announces what the interest rate is. They don't need the treasuries in order to achieve the overnight interest rate target. So now why do we do it? Habit. And maybe because financial markets like having a risk-free asset that they can use to diversify portfolios that has some interest attached to it. I mean, it's not a bad deal. It's just that it corrodes the public debate because we keep hearing the debt and the burden of the debt and the need to pay down the debt. And it's the fact that we call it debt and we don't call the dollars debt, but we call the treasuries debt. And then we have this totally unproductive and in fact destructive political debate and bad public policy that follows from it.
How would you advise the Prime Minister and Treasurer of a government that were talking last year about moving a budget back into surplus in an economy that's slowing down when unemployment's rising a little? And we have a federal election next year. How would you advise that government as far as their fiscal policies?
Well, look, you're describing a situation, a scenario where the budget is likely going to move on its own in that set of circumstances. In other words, if the economy slows down the way that Stephen is describing and the unemployment rate starts to pick up, the budget already has, your government has in place a suite of programs like unemployment compensation, various programs that kick into place when people qualify because they lose their job or their income drops off. They need public assistance. And so when the economy slows and people start losing their jobs, tax revenues tend to drop off, and spending to support a weak economy automatically increases without members of Parliament or Congress, in our case, doing anything actively, right? You don't have to proactively try to move the deficit higher or eliminate a surplus. The weak economy will do that for you. The better policy response is not to allow the economy to become weak in the first place, but to respond proactively, to recognize that the economy is slowing down, that you don't want to allow unemployment to creep up, the economy to fall into recession. So you get in there and you make some adjustments, and we could debate. I mean, that's a matter of policy, right? Do you want to increase spending on infrastructure or some sort of climate-related spending, healthcare, education? Do you want to do some tax cuts alongside that? I mean, you could have a mix of the two, but you typically would want to relax fiscal policy and allow the deficit to increase to prevent the economy from experiencing the hardship, which is going to increase the deficit anyway, but the ugly way. Right? You can allow it to increase the nice way, or you can let it increase the ugly way.
Because amateur MMT is shouting down people who should be our friends, people like Richard Dennis from the Australian Institute.
I hate it, by the way.
communication. They get yelled at by people saying revenues don't fund government spending. How can we, as people who are knowledgeable and learning, and how can we communicate what we know in a positive way that helps us?
I try to set a good example. You know, who in the world would think that a ragtag group of economists would spark a global movement of the kind that we have now, where people are starting their own podcasts, their own YouTube channels, their own newsletters? This thing has grown beyond anything any of us would have ever imagined. And you cannot wrap your arms around it and get control of all of the different personalities, and it's impossible.
You're trying to explain it over drinks, but it's hard. And where do you start? And then you're like, oh, I skipped that step, and I need to come back to that. And then you just lost. You lost them. Their eyes are glazed over.
The independent producer and director Maren Poitras.
So I made this film to try and help people and help myself tell this story in a more condensed form. Because it is a story too. It has its own story arc, really interesting characters, I think, that are going through the journey from being ignored to being ridiculed and laughed at to being fought, and then maybe they're gonna win. That'll be up to you guys.
Have these beautiful clips of like the orthodox kind of economic advisors trying and failing spectacularly to like explain these like concepts. Have you had any reception from them since the film? And I'm like just interested as to like after seeing the clips, like were they happy to have them in the film?
They have not seen the film yet, so. You guys are one of the, very early audiences. I've kind of been dreading that moment where they find out, because I don't know what's gonna happen. But it'll happen soon. So, we're gonna release in May in the US and have like a theatrical release in New York, DC, and they're gonna find out the hard way, I think. But yeah, so hopefully no one spoils it before then. But I don't know what their reaction will be, honestly. But, again, I just think that for me is so important to put in the film, and that was a big part of my journey to try and find out what is the core of this conflict and controversy, and where does MMT go wrong. So I went to search with the mainstream economists and ask them, where does MMT go wrong? And I couldn't, unfortunately, find someone who had a really good understanding of MMT to begin with to give me a solid critique. Asking those basic questions that MMT poses. If you are the issuer of the currency, why do you need to borrow your own currency? I mean, it's a pretty basic question, but it just hasn't been asked many times to these economists, nor have they thought to ask it. When you try to tease out, how is MMT different from the mainstream? Why is there this harsh conflict? Why are they kind of attacked on Twitter? I think it did always seem to come down to me, to the story we tell about money. What is it? Where does it come from? Is it a physical object like gold that you have to go out and find, dig up out of the ground? Or, is it this social credit-debt relationship of accounting that we create when we create our economies? So I think what I found was with mainstream economists, they're able to hold kind of contradictory ideas in their minds at the same time. Like they can say at one point, the federal government can print the money. They won't go broke. But on the other hand, they also say the government will go broke or they'll run out of money. Instead of the story of barter or the story of gold, we should tell a different story about money to kids.
We have neoliberal growth economics as front course, and 90% of the world's population only have access to 10% of the resources, whatever that percentage is. But now we're talking about we need a new economic system. We need to evolve into an economic system such as a circular economy. So where does modern monetary theory fit into a new way of looking at economics that I suppose the climate crisis we need to move towards, because capitalism as it is isn't going to cover it?
Yes, I think, we can also call that ecological economics or donut economics, the work of Kate Raworth, degrowth, the work of Jason Hickel and many others. There's a lot of these schools of thought that are really thinking about planetary boundaries and sustainability. So how do we bridge that? And that's exactly what the work of Stephen and Gabby with Modern Money Lab. They're really synthesizing modern monetary theory and ecological economics. I think they go together really well. I came from a concern around climate change and these big systemic problems. How do you address inequality and climate change on a systemic level? So how do you organize your economy, organize your real resources to provide, human well-being and health and happiness, as well as ecological well-being within those boundaries. And so that's why I think MMT has really been this kind of missing piece, or this essential piece, the money piece. You need to understand what money is, how it works, in order to understand how you can organize your economy in a way that maybe isn't growing infinitely in GDP. What happens where you have tax revenue declining and you still need to pay for important public services like housing, healthcare, food, water that we need, that are the foundation of a good society? The money piece, understanding where it is, what it is, where it comes from, is pretty much essential to understanding how we can successfully organize our economies to live within planetary boundaries. But of course, we do have to choose to do that. But it doesn't mean it has to be a sacrifice, from the workers. And we've already been, I think, crammed by neoliberalism to live within small margins. So there is an alternative to that model. We just have to realize that money is the public organizing tool. It's not the scarce resource itself.
Please join me in thanking 3 women who are heroes as far as I'm concerned.
Well, there we have it, Kevin. Modern monetary theory is a necessary but not sufficient part of your toolkit when you're redesigning the economy to meet the future, those future challenges.
Yeah, there was good discussions there.
And we saw Stephanie in action there, where she was using MMT as the analytical framework. So when she was describing what's likely to happen if a government's trying to run a surplus, or what kind of choices they should be making, that's where you apply your MMT lens to understand the best choices that you can make when you're managing the economy.
Do you remember when COVID was hitting? And we were,
I do remember.
Yeah, and the people in 3CR going, what's going to happen, what's going to happen? And we're
Everyone was so worried.
And we're going to go, well, the government's going to have to spend.
They're going to have to start spending.
And you and I knew back then.
It's not because we're fortune tellers, it's because we understand how the monetary system works.
Yeah, and that was a coalition government that is absolutely opposed to government intervention in the economy.
When you've got a crisis, Kevin, you have to give up your ideology.
Said John Howard.
As a certain ex-Prime Minister said recently.
Dear me, yeah.
Yeah, and so we had Stephanie there. She really doesn't like people saying that the federal government can print money. She wants to hear us all saying the federal government can spend money.
Yes.
And the reason for that is if you say printing, you're disguising the fact that when the federal government spends, it is at the same time creating new money. So the federal government has one way to spend, and that is to create new money. And I think that's the good news, Kevin.
Yes, and on that good news, I think we should go, because Mafalda is coming up next with Vicky, and we're going to get out of here.
See you in a couple of weeks.
Catch you then.
You've been listening to Radio MMT with Anne and Kev.
We'd love your feedback. Email us on radiommt@gmail.com or search Radio MMT on social media.
Listen to this show anytime wherever you get your podcasts, or on 3cr.org.au/Radio MMT.
Support this show and the station by subscribing to 3cr.org.au and mention Radio MMT.
We thank all our guests.
And we thank economist Professor Bill Mitchell and his mmted.org, educating the masses on modern monetary theory.
And thank you to our listeners for listening. And I thank you, Kevin.
And I thank you, Anne. So what's planned for next week?
Kevin, there is still so much to talk about. We've got to expose all this rotten economics.
Well, that's good, and I get it. Do you reckon we could use a bit more music?
Well, I made a list of all these terrible economic theories. Like, I've heard of the theory of comparative advantage, or the quantity theory of money, or the loanable funds theory.
Have you heard of a band called Single Gun Theory? Like, they're a really good band. I'm sure there's a whole range of, like, macroeconomic music that I could bring into the show.
Yeah, but we really need to do marginal productivity theory, not to mention the natural rate of unemployment and the money multiplier.
You've got a pretty good singing voice. I play bass. Bill, he plays guitar. I reckon we could form a macroeconomics band. Like, we could deliver this whole message by music.
Well, we could call the band the permanent income hypothesis, or the Ricardian equivalence, or rational
I
expectations.
think we're onto something here. We're trying to make macroeconomics more interesting to the masses. We're going to form this band and sing it to them. And we're going to bring the economists in. We're going to get musical.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.